On the afternoon of May 14th, 1940, beleaguered citizens in the Dutch city of Rotterdam looked skyward as they heard the approaching drone of German bombers. Through the thick, noxious smoke drifting upwards from burning buildings, they could just make out the massed formations of Heinkel HE-111s, the infamous black balkenkreuz insignia stark against their white undercarriages. For the next quarter of an hour, over 1,000 high-explosive bombs would smash the Dutch into submission, murdering over 700 civilians and devastating an entire city, callously shattering its short-lived defiance in the face of Nazi tyranny. When the dust had settled, questions arose about how this atrocity, which German field commanders claimed was accidental, had happened. Worse were the theories that it was a deliberate act intended to force Dutch capitulation. This is the story of the bombing of Rotterdam City. Welcome to Wars of the World. By the start of May 1940, Poland, Denmark and Norway were already under Nazi rule, having been crushed by Germany's ingenious blitzkrieg tactics, a brutal combination of lightning-fast armoured mobility and crack infantry units, supported by aerial supremacy. Adolf Hitler now set his eyes on the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium and ultimately France. Victory was to be achieved through the implementation of Fall Gelb, or Case Yellow, also sometimes referred to as the Manstein Plan, after Wehrmacht General Feldmarschall Fritz Erich George Edward von Manstein, who planned it. Focusing on a breakthrough into southern Belgium, Manstein's Heeresgruppe A would provide the main thrust of the invasion, with 5 panzer divisions bulldozing through a weakly defended section of the Ardennes. Heeresgruppe B, under General Fedor von Bock, would also launch a strong but diversionary attack through North Belgium and the Netherlands, drawing the bulk of the defending British and French forces into these areas, where they expected Germany to attack. By rapidly reaching the Channel, Heeresgruppe A and B encircled and trapped Allied forces in Belgium and northern France, forcing the British to evacuate from Dunkirk in the famous Operation Dynamo, and leaving France vulnerable to a full German invasion. The French were defeated within just 6 weeks. Fall Gelb commenced in the early hours of May 10th, with the initial major aerial bombardment of Dutch airfields and ports by the Luftwaffe, destroying a large portion of the country's limited offensive aircraft. Shortly afterwards, the sky was full of some 700 German paratroopers of the elite Fallschirmjäger, tasked with dropping right on top of the Dutch positions and capturing the important airfields, railways and bridges, vital for rearmament, supply and reinforcements. Hours of fierce close-quarters fighting followed, punctuated by precision bombing raids from Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, smashing the ill-prepared Dutch defensive positions and sapping the defenders of critical men and material. Just 6 short hours after the first paratroopers had landed, the strategic Moerdijk Bridge was in German hands, as was the main airfield at Walhaven and those at Valkenburg and Ockenburg. By the end of the day, the Dutch defences were in disarray, yet it was no easy feat for the Fallschirmjäger. Some missed their drop zone, others dropped into the Port du Val and drowned, or they landed in the blazing wreckage of earlier bombings, being burned alive. Over the following 3 days, intense fighting rippled through the country as more and more German units flooded in. Yet despite having inserted paratroopers right into Rotterdam, the second largest city after Amsterdam, they still failed to dislodge the Dutch defenders, who were cautiously optimistic about a reinforcing British breakthrough. Often referred to as a wolf in sheep's clothing, the notorious Heinkel HE-111 was deployed extensively on every front of the European theatre of operations, infamously wreaking destruction and devastation from the skies above Britain during the 1940-41 Blitz. With a maximum speed of 270 miles an hour, or 440 kilometers an hour, and a service ceiling height of just over 21,000 feet, the twin-engine Heinkel was designated a medium bomber and flown by a Luftwaffe crew of 5: pilot, navigator/bombardier, radio operator, and 2 machine gunners. Despite bristling with up to 7 light machine guns, 2 each in the nose and fuselage's waist, 1 mounted in an open dorsal position, and another 2 in the ventral gondola, the bomber was surprisingly vulnerable to fighter plane attacks, relying more on its armored airframe and stubborn ability to return to base in all kinds of fragmented, splintered, and shattered conditions. The variant of Heinkel used during the fall Gelb operations had a wide range of ordnance carrying capabilities, most standard being either 32 110-pound bombs or 8 550-pound bombs. However, it could also be equipped with anti-shipping mines, 4,000-pound or even 5,500-pound external bomb, leveling the takeoff weight as a crazy 29.8 thousand pounds or 13,500 kilograms. As the war progressed, the Heinkel HE-111 was upgraded to a variety of different specifications and roles, including as a torpedo bomber, long-range reconnaissance, night bomber, paratrooper transport, and even became the last aircraft to carry a V-1 bomb to London, before ceasing production in 1944, with over 7,000 being manufactured. Tuesday, 14th of May 1940 would end with the obliteration of 11,000 houses, 19 churches, 23 hospitals, and 62 schools, all in just 13 shocking minutes. But why was such wanton destruction deemed necessary? Could it have been averted, or, as some claim, was it purposely done as a show of Nazi domination? On the evening of the 13th, Queen Wilhelmina and the Dutch government had finally fled aboard British destroyers bound for London, and around 10:30 in the following morning, a German officer arrived at Rotterdam flying a white flag with a letter demanding the surrender of the city. The letter was drafted by Wehrmacht Generalleutnant Rudolf Schmidt, commander of the assaulting 39 Army Corps, and was delivered to Colonel Peter Wilhelmus Charroux in charge of Dutch forces during the previous 3 days of battle. It boldly stated, quote, "The continuing opposition to the offensive of German troops in the open city of Rotterdam forces me to take appropriate measures should this resistance not cease immediately. This may well result in the complete destruction of the city. I petition you, as a man of responsibility, to endeavor everything within your powers to prevent the town of having to bear such a price. Should within 2 hours after the handover of this ultimatum no official reply be received, I will be forced to execute the most extreme measures of destruction." End quote. This reference to extreme measures of destruction had been passed down to Schmidt as a direct order from his superior, General Feldmarschall George von Küchler, commander of the 18th Army, stating in no uncertain terms, quote, "The resistance in Rotterdam should be broken by all means available, if necessary threatening to destroy the city and then carrying out the threat." End quote. Küchler was keenly aware that his forces had to be freed up from the stalemate at Rotterdam to be able to support the invasion of France, and also that a timely seizure of the Netherlands would allow for its airfields to be utilized for operations against Britain. With all of this in mind, as well as pressure from his own superior, Küchler wanted a quick resolution to the battle, regardless of the consequences for the civilian population still inside the city, unable to evacuate. However, Küchler wasn't the only one who was demanding the city's capitulation. Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, one of Adolf Hitler's leading men, was eager to further demonstrate the sheer prowess and dominance of the Luftwaffe, and a show of force such as the destruction of an entire city, especially one that was standing in the way of Nazi Germany, would be a perfect opportunity. This theory is contested amongst historians. At the Nuremberg trials in 1945, Göring denied any knowledge of the surrender negotiations, as well as refuting the claim that the bombing was a deliberate act to achieve Dutch submission. a large part of the original Luftwaffe files and documentation were also destroyed, making it hard to determine who or what type of air support was actually ordered. Upon receiving Schmidt's ultimatum, Charroux refused to be coerced, instead taking his time to draft a response, complaining about formalities. Quote, "Prior to seriously considering your proposal, the letter should be duly signed and mention your name and rank." End quote. It's believed that Charroux was playing for time, either to evacuate the city or in the vain hope that Allied reinforcements would soon arrive. Regardless, Schmidt received this response a little after 12 noon, transmitting via radio to the Luftwaffe. Quote, "Bombardment of Rotterdam postponed because of capitulation negotiations. Report new takeoff status." End quote. But it was already too late. The bombers were already in the air, and having reeled in their radio antennas, they were already unreachable. "90 Heinkel HE-111s of the Luftwaffe's Kampfgeschwader 54, aptly named Das Totenkopfgeschwader, or the Skull Squadron, were approaching from the south and the northeast, laden with a mix of 110-pound and 550-pound high-explosive bombs. Just as General Lieutenant Schmidt was handing over his second surrender ultimatum to Dutch negotiators, at around 20 past 1, he heard the heavy drone of the bombers overhead. Suddenly realizing that they hadn't received his abort command, he proclaimed, "My God, this is a catastrophe!" An emergency last resort had been agreed upon during the raid's briefing, for the troops on the ground to fire red flares into the air to wave off the bombers, regardless of their previous orders or instructions, and Schmidt hastily directed his men to fire them. But smoke from the burning city and incessant artillery bombardments still hung thick in the air, limiting the visibility of the approaching bombers, flying at just over 2,000 feet, and obscuring the arc of the red warning flares. The right wing of 54 Heinkels, under the command of Oberst Walter Lackner, approached from the northeast, unaware of the chaos beneath them, and began their bombing run. The other wing, consisting of 36 bombers, under Oberstleutnant Höhne, commenced their own run. But at the last minute, Höhne saw one of the red flares below and abandoned the raid, with just 3 of his Heinkels having dropped their ordnance. Yet unfortunately, Lackner's bombardment had wrought more than enough devastation. In just 13 short minutes, 1,150 110-pound bombs and 158 550-pound bombs had been dropped on Rotterdam.
A haze began to cover the western sky, and as it came nearer, it turned the glorious spring day into a gloomy mid-November darkness. And as we stood there gazing at the sky and not understanding what was happening, a flake of paper came down, and another one, and more. Some were charred around the edges, some had flowers printed on them like wallpaper, others had print. There is not one street standing in this neighborhood, nothing but heaps of rubble. It is as if a giant steamroller has driven over a large part of Rotterdam and flattened everything.
These are just 2 excerpts from the numerous accounts that recall the ghastly bombing of Rotterdam. The first one from a civilian in Utrecht, who witnessed the shocking aftermath nearly 50 kilometers away. The city had been wiped off the map. 642 acres, or 2.6 square kilometers of civilization was gone, and Rotterdam signed their surrender at 20 past 4 that afternoon. Out of a population of 620,000, almost 80,000 were instantly made homeless. Over 700 were dead, and mass casualties had left swathes of the population injured or maimed for life. Inadequate numbers of civilian bomb shelters, paired with the unexpected nature and ferocity of the bombardment, had caught the civilians unaware. Almost immediately, the issue was raised of what to do with the wreckage, the human remains, and the scorched carcass of once a magnificent city. Rotterdam was burning uncontrollably, and soon merging into a huge, self-sustained firestorm that devastated everything in its path, melting bodies and debris into unidentifiable tragedy. Civilians were quickly mobilized into working parties, sifting through the rubble for survivors and gathering the dead, a grisly task that seemed to have no limit to its horror. As recounted here, quote, "On one occasion, the men were asked by a clergyman to search for 3 young maids who had taken refuge in a vault under a church. The men removed some rubble, opened the hot door, and were hit by an intense heat and stench. Inside there were the 3 girls, but they were dead, sitting on a bench. One crew member held his breath, ran inside and tried to pull one girl out, but she had liquefied inside the overheated vault. End quote. The dead were carried to Kruijsvik General Cemetery in handcarts, taxis, buses, garbage trucks, and even wheelbarrows, where they were stacked in preparation for burial in mass graves, with their identities largely being unknown and their bodies incomplete. At the cemetery, there was one mass grave of 561 civilians, interred between the 19th of May and the 5th of June 1940, that included 125 unidentified dead, listed only as man, woman, or human being. Another 2 mass graves were later opened, and all 3 remain untouched to this day. Some families were fortunate enough to be buried with their loved ones, in individual graves or family plots. Yet even this was no consolation to the heartbreak. One woman discovered that there was very little left that was recognizable of her 7 relatives and a neighbor, and she was only able to bury 8 unidentifiable pairs of feet in one coffin. For months after the bombing, carbonized skeletal remains were being found across the city, uncovered during the cleanup in little piles under the rubble, or entombed in cellars that served as death traps. What little remained was shoveled up and transferred to any of the mass graves in wheelbarrows. Rotterdam's senior council and authorities made the decision to demolish what remained of the city and start afresh, choosing only to retain the 17th century De Noord Tower Mill, City Hall, and medieval Groot de Sint Laurenskerk, the Church of St. Lawrence. The German bombing of Rotterdam was a colossal tragedy, made all the more sickening by the knowledge that it could have been averted, yet serving as a haunting epitaph to the horrors of unchecked Nazi domination and aggression. Yet fate was to deal the city another cruel hand during the war. On March 31st, 1943, a raid was conducted against the occupying Germans in Rotterdam by 33 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers of the United States Armed Forces. But foul weather conditions over the targeted shipyard caused them to release their 1,000-pound bombs short. Nearly 100 tons of explosives were dropped on largely civilian areas, namely the working-class neighborhoods of Bospolder and Tussendijken, killing 417 civilians and destroying more than 2,600 homes, leaving some 16,500 people homeless, and once again subjecting Rotterdam citizens to barbarous punishment from the skies.